And so everything was set for the wedding. And as it turned out, this was an arranged marriage, and the man didn't really want to marry my grandmother. So on the day of the wedding, he never showed up. So what happens to my grandmother? Well, so my great grandfather then said, well, you're not good enough for him, then we're going to give you over to the side of the prostitute village, because you're not good enough to marry this man. You'll never be good enough to marry anyone. So they were very strict with women in those days. So then this other gentleman who really did love my grandmother came along and said, no, I will marry her.
Well, hello everyone. With us today we have Sister Maria from the Sisters of Mercy, and today we're going to get to hear a little bit more about your family and your origins. So do you want to go ahead and just first talk about where your family came from and how you got here today?
Yes. So my family comes from, my mother's side of the family comes from a small town in Guanajuato, and the name of it is Pénjamo. And my father's side comes from Lagos de Moreno, which is in the state of Jalisco. And they met in Sonora. But going back to how we came to the United States is a very interesting history, because my grandmother was not allowed to be educated because women did not belong to the working class. They had to stay home and take care of families and know how to do everything in the house. So instead of educating her, they put her in a school to learn all the rudimentaries of how to crochet, how to embroidery, how to knit, and do all of that. So she was fabulous with all of those things around, women's types of work. And so before she married, she had to learn to take in those days, it was the custom that the men in her village wore the white pants and the white shirt. And so in order for her to be accepted as the bride for this particular man, she had to embroidery 2/3 of the pants of the leg that they wore. And they were like putter pushers that we call kind of short pants, crop pants. And then the mother-in-law would investigate the embroidery. And if the mother-in-law didn't deem her good enough, then she would not be allowed to marry the man, her son. And so everything was set for the wedding. And as it turned out, this was an arranged marriage, and the man didn't really want to marry my grandmother. So on the day of the wedding, he never showed up. So what happens to my grandmother? Well, so my great grandfather then said, well, you're not good enough for him, then we're going to give you over to the side of the prostitute village, because you're not good enough to marry this man. You'll never be good enough to marry anyone. So they were very strict with women in those days. So then this other gentleman who really did love my grandmother came along and said, no, I will marry her. So he was like kind of Saint Joseph who rescued her. And then they married there, had the whole wedding, and then eventually came back. My grandfather said, I'm going to take you to the United States. And this was in 1915, okay? So after about 9 months, after being married 9 months, then they come to the United States. And of course they came illegally, because you couldn't come across the border. So what happened? My grandmother at that point was almost ready to give birth to their first child. So he put her in a long canoe, and he piled wood on top of her so that no one could see her. And then he just kept pushing the boat a little further. And it was in the Gulf going into Texas. And they would flash the lights and say, get back to the coast. And he would say, just a little more, I need some more wood for us to be able to cook our food, and blah, blah, blah. So they continued the journey across the river until they got to the side of the United States. And there they found a little kind of like a shed where they hid my grandmother for about 9 days until they felt it was safe for her to come out. Imagine yourself being pregnant, almost ready to give birth and having to hide in this little shed. And so
that's an incredible journey to make as is. I can't even imagine what that would be like pregnant.
Yeah. So finally, they get her out, and the family takes them in and gives them refuge. And she gives birth to my Aunt Lupe. So, and that was her first child. So they lived throughout the South. They lived in Oklahoma, and they came back into Texas. Then they went into Arizona, and they ended up in Los Angeles. Because as you know, Los Angeles at one time, they thought that it would be the capital of Mexico before the United States bought that property. And so they always had this big dream of living in LA. So then the rest of their lives were really spent in Los Angeles, and that's where my mother was born. During that time, somehow my grandfather left my grandmother for another woman. And so my grandmother was a very strong woman, and she decided to sell her house and take all the children to Mexico. Well, that was a big mistake because my grandmother had no papers and couldn't get back if she decided to come back. And all the kids were underage. So she had to live in Mexico with my mom and all the other kids until each one of them was 16 years old and old enough to work. The government would not let them come back. So my mother spent most of her life they went from Pénjamo to the border of Sonora, because at that point, my grandmother didn't realize she couldn't cross the border. And so my mother lived there for 6 years until she turned 16 and was able to come back with an incredible story of trying to survive, because as you know, there wasn't a lot of employment for women during those times. And that would have been in the 1930s. So my mother would do things like carry 10 gallons. Imagine she was a very small woman and not even 5'2", and she would carry these 5-gallon or 10-gallon jugs of gasoline for people. She would clean houses. She would, the women on this side of the border would pay her to carry material over to their families to Mexico, and they would wrap it around her so that they couldn't see it at the border. And that's how she made her money, doing some, I guess, illegal things that they wouldn't, allow, not bad things. I mean, material is nothing, but the people in Mexico loved it because it lasts longer than the material they had, or the dye or something was different. And so, and that's how my mother helped my grandmother to raise the kids and pay the rent and get the food. So it was an incredible existence for them. Now, my father, he was born in Miami, Arizona, because the family would travel all over. My grandfather was a miner. And so he was always mining copper and looking after the gold they used to talk about in the United States. And so they ended up going up to Arizona. So my grandfather really was always looking to make his wealth through finding this gold. But in the meantime, he was paid whatever wages he would get through copper. So back and forth, Arizona, I don't think was yet a state. And so they settled kind of in Miami, Arizona, but they would go up to different parts of Arizona where the mines were. So I visited some of the places, which is just amazing how they ever survived in those areas. But so then eventually my father was orphaned because my grandfather was not the nicest man. And he was really strict with the kids. And so my grandfather, one time with my Aunt Vicky, decided that she had done something very wrong, worth hitting him with the belt so badly that he left her for dead. And the police somebody turned him in. They saw him whipping her. So they turned him in, and he was sent back to the border. He was expelled from the United States and could never come back. In the meantime, here are 5 kids, and they're all left orphaned because by that time my grandmother, his wife, had died from having her, imagine this, 13th kid at the age of 26. I can't even fathom that, but only 7 of them survived, and 5 of them were left at that time. And so all the kids, the older girls looked after the younger ones, But my dad kind of, he was only 4, but he got to be about 11 or 12, he decided to just journey off and venture for himself and earn his own way, just doing odds and ends for different people. So my dad was an amazing man. And when he was about 16, he made himself pass to be 18 and joined the military. And so, and so that really gave him a good solid foundation. And he, because they had been in Arizona, and he decided, to settle there. And that's where he met my mother, who was crossing Sonora from Mexico to Sonora, Arizona. So they met in Sonora, Arizona. And so then my grandmother, my mother's mother, decided she was moving back to Los Angeles because 2 of her children had married and they were now living there. And so then my dad had fallen in love with my mom because, they had dated a little bit on the secret because there was no such thing as dating in those days unless you had permission from your parents. And so my dad would write to her, and then finally he followed her and came to Los Angeles and asked for her hand in marriage. And so they ended up marrying there in Los Angeles, and then moving to Sacramento after a few months to start life, because that's where my father got his job, to work for HCD Modix that made clay pipe and brick. And he worked there until he retired. And that was kind of, he would not let my mother work. She could work at home. And she used to do odds and ends like babysit and things like that, and so my mom was always at home with us and to raise us. And that's how he saw both parents, delightful people, gave us a lot of morals, raised us very strict, kind of in a sense of what the rules and regulations were of Mexico. But, a great foundation to our lives, for respect of all people, so that's kind of in a nutshell, for how we came to be in Sacramento.
Wow. Yeah. That sounds like a very interesting story of, how your parents met and ended up in Sacramento. And I was also just curious because it sounds like you have a very niche line of work that you do. How has this inspired your career aspirations?
So I guess at home we always had a statuary, of saints, and my grandmother would always be praying the rosary, and so she would get us to learn the prayers in Spanish. And there was always this little baby infant Jesus in the statuary. It was a glass little statuary. And so every morning I'd talk to the baby Jesus, and I'd see my grandmother and how she related to the saints and how she was so, she always blessed us when we left home, and everything was bless this, bless that, thank God, yes, with God's grace, God was always a part of our family. And so as a child, I learned this relationship with God. And I learned to love him very much because he was our Tata Dios, which is like our Father God, if you were to translate that. But it's a very endearing term, which we don't have in English. So, I got to love him. But it didn't stop me from dating. I still dated, and I was a normal teenager, loved sports, loved everything. But somehow there was always this little yearning inside of myself that said, I have to serve the world, not just one man. And so I was ready to get married. I had dated this gentleman for 3 years out of high school. He was 10 years older than I was. But something inside of me said I would never be happy married to just one man and a family. I had to do more than that. And so I always had this idea in the back of my head that I would become a sister. And so I had to find out for myself whether this is really what God wanted or if he wanted me to marry. And so once I entered and found the Sisters of Mercy through Father Dan Madigan, I was really inspired to become a sister and serve the world.
Wow, that's a beautiful story.
Yeah, thank you.
Great. Well, is there any last comments or anything that you wanted to add before we wrap up?
Well, I guess just thank you for your time, and I really appreciate this opportunity.
Yeah, thank you so much again for your time as well. And we also, when we edit the videos, if you have any like pictures of yourself or your parents, if you want to just go ahead and email that over to me, we can add that on top of the video as you're telling your story.
Okay, all right. Thank you so much.